Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
Friends in Youth, Choosing Sides in the English Civil War is a new dual biography by Minoo Dinshaw, looking at two old friends on the opposite sides of the English Civil War, a dazzling history from the acclaimed author of Outlandish Night. Delighted to say that joining us live, probably from somewhere on Marsden Moor or Newbury or somewhere like that, is the author.
If only from West London, in fact, which plays a part in the tale too.
Marvellous. Minoo, good morning to you, sir. How are you doing?
Very well. Thank you for having me. Delighted to be here.
Well, I'm delighted to have you with me because I will put my hands in the air because when I was a sallow and shallow youth, 14, 15, one of my things that I really got into was the English Civil War because we tend to sort of gloss over it a little bit. It gets lost in that period between, the Tudors, a bit of the Stuarts, and then we're into the Georgians. But this was a conflict that absolutely rent England apart, didn't it?
I think it's the most interesting and important part of our history, especially right now. I was composing this book during Brexit and so on, but the country which we've been part of and the system that went along fairly seamlessly until 2016, I would say, grew out of the results of the English Civil War. But you're right, it gets less airtime than the Tudors, which I think is a fascinating question. I think it comes down to it's interesting and it's difficult. It's hard for all but the most promising school children, and then it's not picked up sufficiently at university. It's good for you and it's delicious.
Indeed, and it's such an interesting cast of characters, and also it's one of the great what ifs because other countries have a revolution, they depose their monarch, and the monarchy is never comes back, and they become republics or whatever they become. But the whole thing with the English Civil War is obviously you have this clash of ideologies. You have the Cromwell years, and then we have the Restoration. But that's going forth a bit. So tell me. Give me, if you like, a run-up. Let's have a little bit of a refresher about how, if you like, the Civil War happened and your two main protagonists.
So my two young men, Bulstrode Whitlock and Edward Hyde, known as Ned Hyde, they were nearly the same age, Hyde 4 years younger. They were both from legal families and grew up studying the law. Whitlock was much more promising. He was his family's beloved heir and always regarded as a very brilliant child, a prodigy at school and university, whereas Hyde was the sort of bookish younger son. They expected him probably to grow up into an Anglican priest, an academic, that kind of thing. But his elder brother died, and he rather reluctantly found himself studying the law as well. In this situation, the teacher's pet boy wonder and the slightly bookish layabout became close friends. They were growing up during a time of peace when Charles had decided to rule without Parliament and was doing so rather effectively. But it was frustrating if you were an ambitious young gentleman because you were locked out from power, from the chance to forge your country's history in a way that your fathers and uncles hadn't been. And so our two friends grew up in this sort of contradictory state where they really relished the peace, the culture, the literature, the music, the court, but they are also conscious of a certain frustration and existential block on their careers.
Because something's just gone bing in my O-level sort of history. Divine Right of Kings, Charles I. Does he revert? He invokes the Divine Right of Kings.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, what I would say about the Divine Right of Kings is it's a rather recent ideology, which Charles's father, the Scottish King James VI and First of England, was particularly fond of. However, in the case of James, it was slightly bark worse than bite. James was rather a subtle thinker and a very garrulous man. It's a mistake to take him at face value a lot of the time. And he actually knows how to compromise and how to play the game, having survived a nightmarish childhood and extremely long reign in Scotland. Charles is, although a very aesthetic man and in some ways intelligent, just a more literal-minded thinker and makes the mistake of believing his father's theory and trying to put it into practice to the letter. effectively.
And so what sort of effect does that have? So that has the effect of basically he's the man. But obviously, on the continent, Europe is finally coming out of the late Middle Ages, obviously, because we're having, you've got the Renaissance happening in Italy. Like I said before, we've had the Tudors and the Stuarts and the whole thing. Does this put England, if you like, sort of isolated? And if you are, a young man having these thoughts about what it means to be a human being and society and whatever, this is something that obviously is not going to go down very well with your ideology.
Well, while young men are growing up, England is actually isolated in a good way. Increasingly, Germany, Europe is falling into religious warfare, which England has been spared. And both Hyde and Whitlock, on the whole, do appreciate this. But there are a lot of people at the time that don't. The king's sister, the more popular princess, more Protestant, more Calvinist, Elizabeth of Bohemia, has become the Queen of Bohemia, but been deposed by Habsburg forces. And there's a lot of suggestions that Charles is being a layabout, not sending troops to help her, not taking part in the Protestant International, not fighting against the Antichrist, the Church of Rome. And this is a lot of sort of Puritans responding to these kind of ideas. Hyde and Whitlock, on the whole, do relish peace, civilization, and Whitlock's speeches warning against civil war as it begins to brew are particularly poignant. He really is conscious of the mercenaries burning up homes across Germany and even France, and is desperate for the same not to happen in England. Just
refresh me, because there are so many wars happening because you've got mentioned the Habsburgs. Obviously, we've got the Spanish now. That we've got the Spanish as well, having a crack at everything that moves because of their devoutness as well. Oh, is it the war? Is it the 7 Years' War? Which was war we're talking?
The 30 Years' War is developing. Of course, not called the 30 Years' War because they don't know how long it's going to last. But it is already a notoriously savage war filled with atrocities. It's a war in which King Charles's nephews are closely involved. Their territory, their Palatinate, is being taken over by Habsburg forces. And the most famous figure here is Prince Rupert of the Rhine, who loses a battle fighting for his father's cause at an incredibly young age and is captured, has to take a vow not to fight against the Holy Roman Emperor, and returns home to England to fight for his uncle Charles instead. Now, Prince Rupert has been trained in a very tough school of continental military tactics, and so he thinks nothing of, for instance, extracting protection money from the Mayor of Leicester, or sacking Bolton, or attacking Brentford at the edge of London in the middle of a treaty. This is normal continental practice, but Englishmen who have not known war for a very long time, since the Wars of the Roses on their own soil, Rupert becomes a hate figure. His very name, Robert in English, makes jokes about Prince Robber. The word plunder enters the English language. And this is just a difference of norms. Savage continental norms versus placid English norms. Because
also you have that whole thing with mercenaries and you're bringing in from all over the place. It's normal. Can we just say with Prince Rupert, he brings Boy to battle, which is his dog?
Yes. The Boy, I fear, doesn't feature sufficiently in my book. There are a few other animals. A key figure, a close patron of both my protagonists, Archbishop Laud, was very fond of cats, and indeed possibly introduced the tabby cat, Aubrey tells us, into England from Cyprus. He also had a pet tortoise, which lived either into the reign of Queen Anne or that of one of the Georges. I'm not quite clear which.
Okay, so let's go before we go down that animal thing. And I love Prince Rupert because he was just so flamboyant, and he brought that professional sort of mercenary thing to the battlefield. So people will say, okay, you got Cromwell, the Roundheads. Other people think that the Cavaliers are all sort of handkerchiefs and big hats. So, but break it down as to how this whole how it builds, and how the Friends sort of go for different sides. Because we tend to think that, the Roundheads are really severe, that no fun whatsoever. And on the other side, it's all sort of Rupert Everett impersonators.
Exactly. Now, I think, interestingly, this national dichotomy by now, but when you and I are talking, I think it is rather important and interesting, and I think you can tell something about people because of the way our society has evolved by what they think about Roundheads and Cavaliers. But of course, in the time we're talking about, these concepts were still emerging, and in practice, people were very much the same on both sides. Now, certainly, Hyde and Whitlock were similar to one another, and in many ways, each exemplified the characteristics that one would associate with the opposite side. For instance, Whitlock was a ladies' man. Although he had a limp, he liked to dance. He loved music. He loved French culture, and the Queen, who was a French princess, actually found him a very charming man. Whereas on the other hand, Hyde was, not particularly dashing, not a military hero in any way. Very bookish, very serious. He loved drinking and good company, but he was quite a sort of serious intellectual. So in some ways, they both represent ideas that might now be associated with the wrong side of what they.
So Whitlock goes with the Puritans.
Whitlock decides to stick with the parliamentarians, and Hyde decides to stick with the king. But both of them have exactly the same motives. Hyde believes that he can be a sensible influence on the king, and Whitlock believes he can be a restraining force in Parliament. They both want the same thing, which is the king and Parliament working together effectively, an end to the war, moderate reform of government, and everybody getting along and saving England from this atrocious situation.
Because we have been here in history all the way through with, barons, with lords sort of playing chicken with the king who blinks first, because it's an incredibly expensive proposition to draw out an army or to arrange an army. And also, open warfare is not good for, hasn't, as you said before, it hasn't really been seen in England since the wars of, since the Wars of the Roses, Plantagenets, whatever, going all the way back to the anarchy. And nobody wants, sort of Matilda and Stephen sort of running around the countryside again. So, the English Civil War, is it an immediate? Is there a flashpoint? How does it develop, and how do our two friends sort of reconcile each other, or how does their friendship sort of develop during this, if at all?
Well, of course, the English Civil War is different. It is not a dynastic conflict, and it is not only a baronial conflict, although there is an element of an overmighty aristocracy. Crucially, though, the aristocracy are exerting power not with their own private armies, but by using politics, parliament, law. So it's a battle of ideas in a way that hasn't been seen before in England. And how do our friends? How does their friendship develop? Well, the interesting thing is that they are able to remain friends at all, but they do. They continue to write to each other some way into the English Civil War. They're both involved in all the peace treaties, in public and in private. They have quiet hole-in-the-corner conferences together, sometimes in rather seedy inns, to see what they can get done. There's one extraordinary moment where Whitlock has been, in order to insult the parliamentarians, the parliamentarian diplomats, the royalists in the king's capital of Oxford, have housed them in an inn which is notoriously a Catholic hideout, where the gunpowder plotters were said to have met. So Hyde goes to meet Whitlock in this inn, the Catherine Wheel. They have a chat, Hyde leaves, and then there's immediately a sort of rumpus, arguably even a sort of assassination attempt by some rowdy royalist soldiers on Whitlock. And it seems that Whitlock is not completely without suspicion that his friend could even have known about it. And yet they continue to do their best to speak to each other. I think by the time I end my book, the latest chronological point of my book is the Treaty of Uxbridge, which is the last great effort to stop the war. Hyde, it seems to me, is conflicted, is partly treating in earnest and partly has no more hope and is just playing for time. But Whitlock is extremely sincere, and they're both doing their best. Their friendship is still on the road. There is, however, a very good quotation from Hyde, just a quick one, which I feel sums up how he came to feel about his friendship with Whitlock. I now can't find it word to word, but it's something
You can never find the bit, trust me. It happens to me all the time. You can never find the bit you need, especially when you're on live radio.
It's very simple, though. It's without faith, true friendship is impossible. He says something along those lines. And I think that's how he comes to think about Whitlock, with a certain amount of regret and understanding for Whitlock's position. He realises Whitlock is a man of property. His property is near London. Whitlock doesn't just want to destroy his life. He doesn't have anything against the king or against Hyde. He just wants the whole country to calm down, but he isn't going to stick his neck out. And Hyde gets that and never nurtures a really personal animus against his old friend. But there is a sort of regretful loosening of those old ties.
Here's the thing, because when you think civil wars, I'm based in Spain. Okay, so Spanish Civil War.
Fascinating parallel. Absolutely.
Yeah, immensely confusing as well. I mean, there are so many factions and the whole situation. American Civil War, you can argue, is one of the horrendous conflict, lays waste to huge amounts of obviously the American South. English Civil War. I mean, there seems to be a lot of fluidity in terms of moving around the country. I mean, you say that, Rupert sacks or destroys Bolton, but in terms of actual damage to the society, I mean, just refresh me on this one.
I think the damage to society was immense. The damage to the population in England was severe, but in Scotland was dreadful, and in Ireland was, horrific. I think that a large quantity of the population did not entertain decisively strong feelings in either direction, but was affected by the war inevitably nonetheless. You get this phenomenon at a later period than in my book, the clubmen, which is groups of local militias who rise up to defend their local areas from both sides rather reasonably. Yes, I think the devastation was immense and regrettable, and regretted deeply by both my protagonists, and prophesied in particular by Whitlock.
So how did you find these two? And I mean, obviously, source materials. How did you find about them and bring life to them, as it were?
Well, the key to my book really is that they are both extremely important historians and active politicians. So their own published material about their own very well-connected lives is voluminous. However, I did not initially know very much about Whitlock. He was mostly just a name to me when I entered upon this idea. I wanted to write about Hyde. I wanted to write about moderate politicians during the 17th century. We were just after Brexit, and I was thinking about, how we'd managed it last time, as it were. I knew a lot about Hyde. I'd read a lot of him. But as I was researching him, I realized that there was this extraordinary parallel friendship with Whitlock, and that by looking at them both, I could actually, as it were, have a man in both camps and tell the story of, at the very least, the early part of the Civil War, with a pair of eyes in the right place at the right time, almost all of the time, from my point of view. And yeah, as a drama and as a remarkably intertwined pair of lives, it's worked for me in a way I found very elegant and stimulating.
Yeah, I mean, I find it's fascinating with Whitlock and Hyde, because we have that, the Roundheads of the Puritans are very sort of straight up on the whole thing. No fun, no dancing, no music, and like, as I said before, there's even sort of Roundheads and Cavaliers in Barbados, isn't there? At one point, there's a little Caribbean connection, which I think is just wonderful. But
Whitlock's brother-in-law becomes a Caribbean governor later on. For the royalists, in fact. So that tells you enough about the complexities of the period.
What are you hoping then that people are going to discover and learn and take from this book? Is it great? I mean, because again, I think it's one of the great. We have dramas about every other period, Bridgerton, the other Berlin Girl, etc., etc. And the two great missed up, the ones that don't get enough coverage, Plantagenets, and also the English Civil War.
So I think one macro lesson is that the Civil War was an unnecessary tragedy. Certainly when you look at it through these two pair of eyes, and I don't pretend that that's the objective or decisive or only truth, but if you look at the Civil War through these two friends, both of them very open-minded in religion and very active in politics. For them, the war was a mess caused by political ambition that shouldn't have happened. And England could perfectly well have proceeded in the direction that we're sort of grandly familiar with towards 1688, compromise, parliamentary democracy, without all this nonsense. So there's that. The other thing is really about the power, the limited but precious power of friendship. There's obviously this one key friendship at the core and center of my narrative, but there are so many other friendships at every level. Hyde's relationship with Charles I, both my heroes' relationship with Archbishop Laud, so many friendships, Hyde and Falkland. And what I came to see about friendship was that although friendship delivered some political victories, more often in the end it was powerless against the sort of opposite, entrenched fanaticism and ambition. But in the longer term, it's as if friendship can present an ideal, an example that can outlast the tragedy, the blood, the closed minds, and give us a window into something very precious that we can remember for good.
Wonderful stuff. What after this one? What are you working on next, then, Minoo? What's next in your sights in terms of writing?
I haven't quite decided yet. I would like to return to my two friends, and their lives continue to intersect in complicated and rather darker ways for the second half of their lives. But I may take a little break before. I'm even contemplating a novel, possibly set in Renaissance Italy, actually. We'll see.
Well, at least the research will be fun with that one. The book is called Friends in Youth, Choosing Sides in the English Civil War. It's by Minoo Dinshaw we're speaking to today. If people want to find you online, you're on X, Twitter, or what? Yeah?
Yes, I tweet on whatever it's called now, X, at Minoo, like my first name, and then Framrose, which is spelled Framroze.
That'll keep them guessing. You can also order it as well via our own virtual bookstore. The book is called Friends in Youth. It's by Minoo Dinshaw. It's been an absolute, as you can tell, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this morning.
Thank you, Giles.